Hello, guys and gals, and this is part 7 of our reading of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. It is a novelization by Richie Tankersley Cusick, and based on the screenplay by Joss Whedon. This is part 7, so this is probably going to be our final part to this particular book. We've been reading 27 pages at a time, and these chapters are super short. Anyways, as always, we are going to go over the copyright information because this is not my intellectual property, it's somebody else's. And we want to make sure and give them credit. It says here, all rights reserved, including the right to reproduce this book or portions thereof in any form whatsoever. So, yeah. In the last episode, Buffy got attacked by Emmeline, the one-armed vampire. He ended up getting his arm ripped off a couple parts back. And she had a stake with her. And she led the vampires away from the gym, but there's still vampires attacking the dance, which is taking place in the gym. And so there's a lot of chaos there. And Pike ended up killing Benny by skewering him on a table leg. But anyways, we are going to pick up where we left off. All clear? Emmeline whispered. Buffy screamed and spun around. She felt a sick jolt as Emmeline hit her and sent her flying back into the classroom. The stake sailed out of her hand, landing on a desk by the window. Buffy did not land nearly as well. She crashed into a row of desks and wrenched her leg badly. Emmeline gave his most repulsive laugh and advanced towards her. Pleased to meet you. Won't you guess He kicked her violently. Name. Buffy glared at him, defiant through her pain. It wouldn't be Stumpy, would it? He kicked her again. How about Lefty? You're a fool, bloodbag, and now you'll die a fool. Emmeline grabbed her by the neck with one arm and pinned her against the wall in the corner. Buffy groped wildly for the stake, but it was just out of her reach. She could feel Emmeline squeezing the life out of her, could smell the stench of his breath, his face only inches away from her own. The chosen one, he mocked. You're just another blood bag, not even fit to die for the master. When will you ever learn? Buffy looked around frantically for help. She saw the bottom of the window shade and the pole dangling aimlessly. She struggled to get her words out. I do know one thing. What? Emmeline sneered. I know what time sunrise is. Summoning all her strength, she yanked down on the shade pole and let it go. No! Emmeline screamed. He turned in horror, releasing Buffy, trying to catch the shade. The instant she was free, Buffy grabbed the stake and, in one swift motion, buried it in Emmeline's back. The shade went up, flapping loudly as it spun. Beyond the window pane, it was still pitch black. Wide-eyed, silent, Emmeline gazed deep into the night, feeling his life flow away. It's about 4 hours, fool, Buffy said softly. Emmeline spun around, dying rage in his eyes. He grabbed Buffy, his strength terrifying even as his body began to smoke. Suddenly, shrieking, he hurled the two of them into the ground with such incredible power that they crashed through the floorboards below. Okay. Chapter 35. Helplessly, Buffy and Emmeline fell through the ceiling and plunged into the pool of blood. Emmeline's body surfaced first, now only a husk. Buffy struggled up next to him, waist deep in the thick red gore. She was soaked through with blood, and her wounds hurt more than ever. Breathing hard, she stood there for a moment, and then her eyes went wide. Oh, please no, not yet. Lothos rose gracefully from the pool. He was smiling. As he held her with his calm stare, Buffy gazed back at him, paralyzed with fear. I knew you'd come, Lothos said, and began to move toward her, the blood lapping at his sides. You knew it too, didn't you? All your life, dreaming, waiting to feed me. At the mention of her fate, Buffy was galvanized into action. She threw several punches at Lothos, but he took them without flinching. She grabbed desperately at what remained of Emmeline and began to pull on the stake still wedged in his chest. Lightning quick, Lothos Lothos closed his hand around hers, squeezing until the stake splintered, and Buffy screamed in pain. With one fluid movement, he knocked her down into the dark red slime. Buffy struggled up and tried to back away from him, but it was almost impossible to wade through the sluggish gore. She saw Lothos look down at Amelin's corpse as if he were contemplating it, and then his face darkened. "Ah, my fool is dead," Lothos said softly. "He was careless, anyways. Still, I'll pull out your tongue for that." Buffy saw his eyes focus upon her once more. Again, she backed up. Again, he came towards her. "Don't you understand?" Lothos went on. "I've killed you a dozen times. Your life is not a blink of an eye, not a single breath. I have lived in the shadows in the pulsing filth behind men's eyes 1,000 years and more. I have conversed with the worms that fed on my corpse. I have bathed in the blood of emperors." Buffy lifted her chin. "Have you ever thrown up in the front row of a Richard Marx concert?" she remarked, her voice breaking the spell of his revelry. "What?" And she was up and out of the pool and turning to run, Lothos momentarily thrown by her insolence. Even then, she didn't get far. Lothos was on her the very second she emerged from the boiler room, from his chamber. He grabbed her by the hair and threw her to the floor. "You waste time. That is a sin." Slowly, he knelt over her as Buffy groped frantically for her purse. She could feel his awesome power, his disdain, as he looked her over and smiled. "You're even weaker than the others," Lothos murmured. "I think you've forgotten something." Buffy pulled out a small cross and thrust it in front of him. Lothos snarked and grabbed it, his hand trapping hers. As the cross burst into flames, he held Buffy's hand tightly, agonizingly, in the fire. "This," he spat at her, "this is your only weapon? Your puny faith?" "No." With the other hand, Buffy quickly held up her hairspray. "My keen fashion sense." She aimed the can at him and squeezed the spray, igniting from the burning cross. A jet of flame whooshed right into his face. Lothos screamed and released her, lurching backwards. His head was on fire. Buffy scrambled up and hobbled away, determined not to look back. With her head hideously aflame, Lothos stumbled wildly about his chamber, then pitched forward with a thick splash into the pool. It took Buffy a few minutes to find her way out of the boiler room. When she came out at last, she limped along the corridor as quickly as she could. "This is the stupidest dance I have ever been to," she muttered. "It's not even a contest." She reached the locked door that said "Gymnasium, authorized personnel only." She put her shoulder to it and pushed. In Lothos' chamber, the Vampire King pulled himself out of the sweet, heavy blood. His head was charred and torn almost beyond recognition, and when he screamed, his cry was thick with rage. The scream filled the hallway. As Buffy shoved the heavy metal door, she suddenly froze, then turned wide-eyed at the unearthly sound. "Oops!" And she could hear him now coming out of his chamber. Through the boiler room, along the hall, she could hear him chasing after her. He was moving much too fast to be only running. Chapter 36. Inside the gym, the battle was nearly over. Pike struggled with the last vampire, holding on tightly, while another student rammed a stake through the creature's heart. As the vampire died, Pike dropped it at his feet and looked slowly around the room. They seemed to have won at last. There were no more vampires loose in the gym. While some kids took care of the wounded, they kept their eyes on the windows, still on the lookout for further attacks. Kimberly sat by the wall, her eyes wide and empty. The door to the hall was boarded up by a table, nailed to its surface, and junk piled in front. One boy looked out through the small window at the top and turned and yelled, "Hey, come here!" Immediately, Pike rushed over to the door, Andy holding a rag on a wound on his neck, joined him. Together they pressed their faces to the glass and peered out the dim light beyond. The long corridor was lined with gray lockers. At the other end of the hallway, Buffy was coming through a door that led to the cellar. She practically collapsed back onto it to shut it behind her. And then she looked around nervously. Pike banged on the gym door. "Buffy!" He glanced at Andy, then back at the barricade. "Help me get this open." Kimberly stood up slowly, shaking her head. "Don't let her in! Don't let her in!" But Pike and Andy ignored her and began to move stuff away from the door. To their surprise, several other kids rushed up to help as Pike pulled at the tabletop. "They'll kill us," but Kimberly shouted hysterically. "Get her out!" Gary Murray stopped in front of Kimberly. He put his hand over her face and pushed her against the wall. Cross-eyed, she slid back down into silence. Out in the hallway, Buffy started limping toward the gym. She could see the door ahead of her, yet it seemed impossibly far away. She tried to concentrate on reaching it, but she kept glancing back over her shoulder toward the door through which she had just escaped. Working feverishly, Pike and Andy and the others almost had the gym door cleared now. Buffy was more than halfway there still, watching behind her. And then, abruptly, the cellar door began to shake. Pike felt the rumbling and looked about in confusion. It came from beneath and all around, a deep, ominous sound. Almost to the gym now, Buffy felt it too. She looked back once more and saw the cellar door trembling violently. As Buffy tried to cross the last 10 feet to the gym, she saw Pike and Andy pull the door wide open. Then, in a sudden explosion of concrete and plaster, Lothos erupted from the floor in front of her, floating there and seething with anger. "You!" He grabbed her and hurled her the length of the hall. As Buffy slammed into someone's locker, it burst open and spilled a notebook out onto the floor. The binder fell open, revealing a plastic case inside loaded with pens and pencils. Drained and hurting, Buffy propped herself up as best she could and looked about her. There was nothing wooden anywhere, nothing sharp within reach, only the long dark hallway, and death riding the air at the other end. "You would challenge me," Lothos hissed. Pike charged Lothos from behind. Andy tried to stop him, but it was too late. Lothos slammed Pike against the wall without even looking at him. His vampire eyes were blazing, and they were still locked on Buffy. "I'll rip the flesh from your stinking bones," Lothos swore. "All of you." He looked back at the frightened students who cowered there in the gym, and his voice rose furiously. "I'm immortal. I'm invincible." "I'm so sure," Buffy said. Lothos roared savagely. He charged Buffy, his feet hardly skimming the ground as he raced down the hall. He was upon her in one fraction of an instant. In one quick motion, Buffy spun, landed on her feet, and thrust her palm out towards his chest. Lothos stopped cold. The silence was endless and terrifying. Buffy looked directly into his eyes, into the raw, mangled madness of his face. Lothos seemed strangely frozen, his eyes wide and shocked as he stared down at himself. Sticking out of the middle of his chest was a small eraser attached to the end of a number 2 pencil. Unsteadily, he took a step back, gazing at Buffy. On his charred features, the semblance of an expression settled deep into his oozing flesh. It looked almost like respect. Buffy stared back at him calmly. He looked unfathomable. Lothos blinked several times, and then he smiled graciously. "Merrick was right. You are a resourceful woman." Heavily he fell back, propped up against a row of lockers. Leaning on the row across from him, Buffy too slid down onto the floor. For a long moment the two of them sat there together. Then Lothos looked down at his chest once more, and again his eyes lifted to Buffy. "It doesn't hurt as much as I had imagined." His eyes closed. As Lothos took his final breath, centuries of life coursed through him, and suddenly, slowly to an end. As Lothos took his final breath, centuries of life coursed through him, and shuddered slowly to an end. Pike lay on the floor at the other end of the hall. Silently, he watched Buffy. Buffy didn't look back at him. She simply sat there, staring into space. Chapter 37. In the bright light of the morning, the gym lay in shambles. Police cars clustered thick in the parking lot. The medical teams tirelessly tended the wounded. For the reporters, it was a field day. For the seniors of Himmerly High, it was a special memory that no one cared much to remember. Like most morbid topics, the story, or at least the media's version of it, was fascinating for a while. The death toll now reached 12 and a half in the tragedy of Himmerly High School. It was at the senior dance 5 days ago that the school was beset by a roving gang of crazed gunmen. Survivors say some 200 of the ruffians laid the school gym under a kind of siege, claiming several lives in the process, said one administrator. Things here will never be the same. But they were. Within days, students walked the same hallways, holding their books the same way, talking about the same old things. In the classrooms, they passed notes, yawned, and fell asleep. In the mall, they window shopped, sucked on Slurpees, laughed with their friends, and dreamed of summer vacation. Kimberly dived gracefully into the cool blue water of a swimming pool. Coming up again on the other side, she climbed out and joined Jeffrey, Jennifer, and two new friends as they lay sunning in her backyard. They had all bought new swimsuits for the occasion, and their noses were all painted with fluorescent zinc. She was even crazier after that, Jennifer was saying to Kimberly, as Kimberly walked up. I mean it. You wouldn't have even recognized her. Buffy? Kimberly guessed. As Jennifer nodded, Kimberly wrinkled her nose in distaste. She didn't even hardly talk to anyone in school, Jennifer went on. Didn't even show up for graduation. The worst is, her parents. This is true. Her parents were going to send her to the Bahamas for graduation, and she refused. True story. She said she didn't want to go. Kimberly looked thoroughly disgusted. It is to vomit. From one of the chairs, a boy looked up, interested in spite of the girl's attitudes. Well, where is she now? He asked. Chapter 38. In the deep, quiet evening, shadows oozed slowly along the ground. As the distant hills began to fade beyond a veil of twilight, a low wind crept suddenly through the trees, stirring their branches with a restless sigh. Buffy led the way confidently up a long stone drive. She was wearing a skirt with an old sports jacket and sneakers. She glanced back at Pike, adjusting the baseball cap, that sat backwards on her head, and then she shifted her knapsack from one hand to the other. I didn't say it was a bad idea, Pike insisted, catching up to her. I just said the timing was off. We could maybe wait till later. Don't be such a fraidy cat, Buffy said. Who's afraid? Besides me, I mean. We've come all this way. We just have to check it out. I got a hunch. You're the boss, Buffy. Oh, no, you're the boss. I just thought maybe we should wait. Buffy stopped at the large, elaborately carved door. She gazed at it for a moment, then turned to Pike. Trust me. She lifted the door knocker, a huge iron monstrous gripped in a gargoyle's mouth as she pounded against the heavy wood of the door. The sound echoed hollowly back and back through old forgotten chambers. Pike and Buffy lifted their heads, gazing up at the castle that towered above them. They saw its ancient stone walls rising out of the craggy hill, its lonely battlements and turrets hiding secrets, the last fading glimpses of its terrifying silhouette etched sharply against the oncoming darkness. And as the two of them stood there, side by side, night fell at last, drenching them both in the sallow light of a rising moon. Okay. About the author. Richie Tankersley Cusick loves vampires. He reads books and watches movies about them. Let me read this again. Richie Tankersley Cusick loves vampires. She reads books and watches movies about them, and she is convinced They really exist. Richie enjoys writing when it is rainy and gloomy outside and likes to have a spooky soundtrack playing in the background. She writes at a desk which originally belonged to a funeral director in the 1800s and which she believes is haunted. Halloween is one of her favorite holidays. She and her husband decorate the entire house, which includes having a body laid in state in the parlor. Life-size models of Frankenstein's monster, and the figure of death to keep watch, and a scary costume for Hannah, their dog. A neighbor recently told them that a previous owner of the house was feared by all of the neighbors' kids, and no one would go to the house on Halloween. Richie is the author of Vampire, Fatal Secrets, and The Mall, coming in mid-September 1992. She and her husband, Rick, live outside Kansas City, where she is currently at work on her next novel. And I believe that's it. That does it. We've read the entire book. If you like this content, this is also a book by Richie Tankersley Cusick, and based on a screenplay by Joss Whedon. Now, if you like all this content, then make sure you like and subscribe, and ring the bell so you know when I upload. Also, if you want to support me in any way, all that information will be in the description below. As always, thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.